Don't you ever wonder how Rick Grimes survived 59 days alone in that hospital? In the very first episode of the show, Days Gone By, Rick wakes to wilted flowers, silence, and a clock on the wall that stopped at 3:47. There's a gurney blocking his door. The hallways are empty except for the dead. And somehow, impossibly, Rick's alive. The IV bag hanging above his bed is dry and empty, but he's breathing, conscious, able to walk. Medical reality says a coma patient needs IV replacement every 24 to 48 hours, or they die from dehydration. Rick was alone for weeks, maybe months. The math doesn't work. The survival doesn't make sense. And yet, there he is, stumbling through the corridors, discovering the apocalypse one horrifying detail at a time. Around his wrist, a hospital bracelet. On the wall, that stopped clock. And blocking his door, that gurney placed there by someone, for some reason, at some point. Tonight, let's trace what might have happened in those lost weeks. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. Let's walk through the evidence together and see if we can understand how one man slept through the end of the world and woke up alive. Here's what we know for certain. Rick Grimes was shot in the line of duty and fell into a coma. That's canon, shown in the opening of Season 1, Episode 1. He's in a hospital bed, machines beeping, Shane and Lori and Carl visiting him, and then cut to black. When we see Rick again, the world's ended. The exact timeline's never explicitly stated in the show, but there are clues. Dr. Jenner's recordings at the CDC in Season 1, Episode 6 show Day 63 on screen when Rick's group arrives, and Rick's been with them for a few days by then, which suggests his coma lasted approximately 59 days, about 2 months. That's a long time to be unconscious and unattended. And the thing is, the outbreak likely began around the same time Rick was shot, or very close to it. The chaos Shane describes, the speed of the collapse, the way the hospital deteriorated, it all suggests the world fell apart while Rick was unconscious, unable to witness any of it. The first days would have been confusion. Hospitals are designed to handle crises, and initially, the staff would have tried. Patients arriving with bites, strange symptoms, high fevers. Doctors trying to diagnose, nurses trying to contain. But walkers don't follow the rules of disease. They don't respond to antibiotics or quarantine protocols. They die and reanimate, and suddenly the ICU is a combat zone. The hospital Rick's in would have been overwhelmed within days, maybe less. And coma patients like Rick? They're not the priority when the building's on fire. The staff would have focused on the people who could walk, who could be evacuated, who had a chance. Rick, unresponsive and requiring constant care, would have been low on the list. Maybe someone marked his chart, "Do not resuscitate." Maybe someone checked on him one last time and then ran. We don't know. But we know the hospital didn't stay staffed for long. The emotional weight of this, the thing that makes it hard to think about, is that Rick was vulnerable in a way most survivors weren't. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. He couldn't even wake up and understand what was happening. Every person who walked past his room had to make a choice. Try to save him, or save themselves. And based on the state of the hospital, when Rick wakes the empty halls, the chained doors, the bodies left to rot, most people chose themselves. That's not cruelty, that's survival. But it means Rick's survival required something else. Something beyond the normal calculus of who lives and who dies. He needed someone to choose him when choosing him didn't make sense. Or he needed to be forgotten, overlooked, invisible enough that the danger passed him by. And maybe both things are true. Maybe Rick survived because someone helped him, and then because no one remembered he was there. That's the mystery we're tracing tonight. The question isn't just, how did Rick survive? It's who made that survival possible, and what did it cost them? Shane's the first person we know tried to save Rick. In Season 1, Episode 2, Guts, there's a flashback showing Shane at the hospital during the evacuation. The building's in chaos. People screaming, gunfire in the distance, staff running. And Shane goes to Rick's room. He checks his pulse, listens for breathing, tries to figure out if Rick's still alive. And here's the thing, Shane can't tell. Rick's so still, so unresponsive that Shane believes he's already gone. There's a moment where Shane puts his ear to Rick's chest, and you can see the desperation on his face, the need to hear a heartbeat. And then the walkers are in the hallway, and Shane has to choose. He looks at Rick one last time, and he leaves. But before he goes, he pushes a gurney in front of the door. It's a barricade, a last attempt to protect Rick from whatever's coming. Shane thinks Rick's dead, but he can't bring himself to leave the body completely exposed. So he blocks the door and runs. That gurney becomes important later, because when Rick wakes in episode 1, it's still there. Mostly. It's been moved at some point the door opens, which means the gurney's not directly blocking it anymore, but it's nearby, like someone pushed it aside and then repositioned it. That detail's easy to miss, but it's significant. Because if the gurney's been moved, that means someone was in Rick's room after Shane left. Someone opened the door, saw Rick, made a decision, and then they either helped him or left him, but they bothered to put the gurney back. Why? If you're looting, you don't reposition furniture. If you're fleeing, you don't stop to tidy. The gurney being there, moved, and replaced, suggests intent. Someone was checking on Rick. Someone knew he was there, and that someone either kept him alive or decided he wasn't a threat. The timeline here is crucial. Shane's visit happens maybe 2 weeks into the outbreak, based on his dialogue in later episodes about when the bombs fell and when the camp formed. By that point, the military's already tried and failed to contain the virus. Atlanta's been napalmed, the power grid's failing or already failed. And Shane, fleeing the hospital with Lori and Carl, believes Rick's dead and buried under the rubble of a collapsing society. He tells Lori Rick's gone, and Lori believes him. Because what else can she believe? The hospital's a war zone. The city's burning. And her husband's in a coma in a building that's about to be overrun. Grief is easier than hope in that scenario. So Shane, Lori, and Carl leave. They join the group at the quarry. They start surviving. And Rick's left behind, alone, with a gurney blocking his door and a world that stopped caring whether he lives or dies. But here's the emotional core of this moment. The thing that makes Shane's choice so devastating. He loved Rick. They were best friends, partners, brothers in every way that mattered. And Shane tried. He went back during an evacuation, risked his life, checked Rick's pulse. He didn't abandon Rick casually. He abandoned Rick because he thought Rick was already gone, and staying would have meant dying for a corpse. That's the calculus of the apocalypse, and Shane made the call. But placing that gurney, that final gesture of protection for a body he believed was already dead, it's love. Misguided, maybe. Pointless, probably. But love nonetheless. And when Rick wakes up 40-some days later and eventually learns what Shane did, he'll have to live with the knowledge that his best friend thought he was dead and tried to protect him anyway. And Shane will have to live with the knowledge that he was wrong, that Rick was alive, and that he left him. That guilt, that weight, it shapes their entire relationship in season 1 and 2. Shane's possessiveness over Lori, his resentment of Rick's leadership, his eventual breakdown, it all traces back to this moment, this choice, this gurney placed in front of a door to protect a man Shane thought was already lost. By week 3, the hospital's a tomb. The power's been out for days, maybe a week. The emergency generators ran out of fuel or failed. The halls are dark except for whatever sunlight filters through the windows. The bodies of staff and patients who died and turned are shambling through the corridors, drawn to noise, movement, anything that suggests life. And Rick's in his room, unconscious, machines silent, IV bag slowly draining. The medical reality here is brutal. A coma patient needs hydration. Without IV fluids, dehydration sets in within days. Severe dehydration leads to organ failure, and organ failure leads to death. Rick's the 4, the one Shane saw still attached in that flashback, might have lasted another few days after the power died, maybe a week if he was lucky and the bag was full. But after that, he should have died. There's no gentle way to say it. Without intervention, without someone replacing that IV, Rick Grimes should have died of dehydration sometime around day 20 or 25. But he didn't. He woke up on day 59. And that means something happened. Either Rick's body survived on reserves we don't understand, or someone helped him. And the show never tells us which. That ambiguity, that gap in the story, is where theory lives. Some fans believe Rick's survival is just a plot necessity, that the show needed him alive so it bent medical reality to make it happen. And that's fair. The Walking Dead's never been a documentary. It prioritizes story over strict realism. But other fans, the ones who like to dig into the details, have noticed something interesting. There's a webisode, a short film released between seasons called The Oath. And in that webisode, we meet a doctor named Dr. Gale McConis, and she's at a hospital, and she's doing some very dark things. And some fans have theorized that Dr. Gale might have crossed paths with Rick, might have been the person who kept him alive during those lost weeks. Now, here's where we have to be careful. The webisode takes place at Harrison Memorial Hospital, and there's no explicit confirmation that's the same hospital where Rick was. The geography's vague, the timeline's unclear, and the show never directly connects Dr. Gale to Rick. So this is speculation, a theory built on circumstantial evidence and narrative possibility. But it's compelling speculation, because Dr. Gale's story fits the gap in Rick's timeline almost perfectly. In The Oath, we see Dr. Gale as the last person left in her hospital. She's stayed behind after the evacuation, and she's broken, traumatized, operating under a twisted moral framework where she decides which patients deserve to live and which should be given mercy. She euthanizes terminal patients, then locks their reanimated bodies in the cafeteria. It's horrific, but it's also a glimpse into what isolation and impossible choices do to a person. And if Dr. Gale's hospital was near Rick's, if she had reason to travel or search for supplies, if she found Rick during one of those supply runs, it's possible she decided to save him. Why would she save Rick specifically? That's the question. And the theory here is psychological. Rick's a coma patient. He's not making choices. He's not hurting anyone. He's not becoming a monster or a coward or a killer. He's just there, unconscious. Innocent in a way no one else in the apocalypse can be, because innocence requires not choosing, and Rick's not able to choose anything. To someone like Dr. Gale, whose sense of morality has been shattered by the things she's seen and done, Rick might have represented something pure. A patient who couldn't disappoint her, couldn't fail her ethical tests, couldn't turn into another person she'd have to kill. So maybe she tended him, checked his IV, replaced the bags when they ran dry, moved the gurney to inspect him, and then replaced it to keep him hidden. Maybe she did that for weeks, keeping Rick alive, because he was the one patient left who was still truly helpless, still truly worth saving. And then, maybe, something happened to Dr. Gale. The webisode ends ambiguously, with a confrontation and a gunshot. And if Dr. Gale died, if she stopped tending Rick around day 50 or 55, that'd explain why Rick woke when he did. Not because he was fully recovered, but because he was dying, and his body forced him awake in a last-ditch attempt to survive. Let's talk about Dr. Gale McConis, because even if we're not certain she saved Rick, her story reveals something important about what the apocalypse does to people who try to hold on to their humanity in impossible situations. In the webisode The Oath, Dr. Gale's portrayed as a woman who stayed at Harrison Memorial Hospital after everyone else evacuated. She's a surgeon, skilled and dedicated, and when the outbreak began, she tried to save people. But as the days passed, as the hospital became a war zone, as patients died and turned and the staff fled, Dr. Gale's ethics started to fracture. She couldn't save everyone. She couldn't even save most people. So she started making choices about who was worth saving and who should be released from suffering. Terminal patients, people with no chance of recovery, she euthanized them with lethal injections. And then, because she couldn't bring herself to destroy their bodies completely, she let them turn and locked them in the hospital cafeteria. The cafeteria becomes a symbol, a twisted memorial. Dr. Gale's keeping the dead, preserving them in some form, because destroying them completely would mean admitting they're gone. It's a kind of madness, but it's also deeply human. She's grieving every patient she couldn't save by keeping their reanimated bodies nearby, as if proximity to death makes her less alone. And when two survivors, Paul and Karina, stumble into the hospital looking for supplies, Dr. Gale's behavior toward them is erratic. She offers to help, but her help comes with conditions, with judgments about whether they're good people who deserve to survive. She's appointed herself judge and executioner, and the power's broken her. By the end of the webisode, there's a confrontation, a gun pointed, and the screen cuts to black. We don't know if Dr. Gale survives, but the implication is that she doesn't, that her story ends in that hospital, surrounded by the dead she couldn't let go. Now, here's the theory, and I want to be clear, it's just a theory. If Dr. Gale's hospital was close to Rick's, if she had reason to search nearby buildings for supplies or other survivors, she might have found Rick. And if she did, Rick would have been exactly the kind of patient who fit her broken moral framework. He's not a bad person making selfish choices. He's not looting or killing or abandoning others. He's unconscious, blameless, a blank slate. To Dr. Gale, someone desperately trying to save people who deserve it, Rick might have seemed like the perfect patient. Someone she could tend without the ethical complications, without the risk that he'd turn out to be cruel or cowardly or evil. So maybe she did tend him. Maybe she checked his IV every few days, replaced the fluids, moved the gurney to inspect him for bed sores or infections, and then replaced it to keep him hidden and protected. Maybe she did this for weeks. From around day 2, Zerohen left and the hospital went dark, to around day 5, Zerohen she likely died in the webisode's confrontation. That'd be 30 days of care, which is just enough to keep Rick alive until his body's reserves and the last IV drips could carry him the final week to consciousness. The emotional weight of this theory, if it's true, is staggering. Because it means Rick survived due to the mercy of a woman who'd lost her mind, who was keeping a cafeteria full of walkers as a monument to her failures, who'd decided she had the right to determine who lived and who died. Rick's life, his survival, his ability to wake up and lead the group and become the man who'd saved so many people, it'd all hinge on the broken compassion of someone who never knew him, never spoke to him, and died before he even woke up. Dr. Gale wouldn't get to see Rick open his eyes, wouldn't know if her care mattered, wouldn't receive any thanks or recognition. She'd just be gone. Another casualty of the early days. Another person ground down by impossible choices. And Rick would walk past the cafeteria doors she marked with, "Don't open dead inside," never knowing that those words were written by the person who kept him breathing. That's tragedy. That's the cost of survival in The Walking Dead. Not glory, not gratitude. Just someone doing what they thought was right, dying for it, and leaving behind a man who'd never know their name. Let's look at the evidence that makes people think Dr. Gale might have helped Rick, because even if we can't prove it, the coincidences are compelling. First, there's the spray-painted message. In Season 1, Episode 1, when Rick's walking through the hospital, he passes a set of double doors that have been chained shut. And on those doors, in red spray paint, are the words, "Don't open dead inside." It's one of the most iconic images from the show's first episode, this ominous warning that tells Rick and us that the building's full of danger. And in the webisode The Oath, we see Dr. Gale spray painting those exact words on the cafeteria doors at Harrison Memorial Hospital. She's locking the reanimated patients inside, and she's marking the doors so anyone who comes by knows not to open them. Now, the question is, are these the same doors? Is Harrison Memorial the same hospital where Rick was? Or is this just a repeated visual motif, a way of showing that multiple hospitals fell the same way? The show never confirms it. There's no line of dialogue saying, Rick was at Harrison Memorial. No explicit connection drawn between the two locations. And that's important to acknowledge, because treating speculation as fact is how misinformation spreads. But here's what we can say. The visual similarity is intentional. The doors look the same. The spray paint's the same. And The Walking Dead's a show that pays attention to details, that uses visual callbacks to connect storylines. So even if Rick wasn't at Harrison Memorial specifically, the implication is that what happened there, the abandonment, the isolation, the descent into moral ambiguity, happened at Rick's hospital too. And if it happened at Rick's hospital, if there was someone there making the same kinds of choices Dr. Gale made, then Rick's survival starts to make sense. Not as a miracle, but as the result of someone's twisted compassion, someone who decided he was worth the effort even when no one else was left to care. The gurney's the second piece of evidence. In Shane's flashback, he pushes a gurney in front of Rick's door to block it. That's canon, confirmed on screen. But when Rick wakes up, the gurney's been moved. The door's not fully blocked anymore, which means Rick can push it open and stumble into the hallway. But the gurney's still nearby, like someone moved it, used the door, and then repositioned it afterward. That's not definitive proof of ongoing care, but it's suggestive. If the gurney had just been knocked aside by walkers or looters, it'd be scattered, chaotic, not carefully placed. The fact that it's still positioned near the door, still serving some kind of function, implies intent. Someone was using that door, and they cared enough to maintain the barricade even after Shane left. That someone could have been Dr. Gale. Or it could have been another survivor, another staff member who stayed behind for a while. We don't know, but we know the gurney didn't move itself. The third piece of evidence is Rick's physical condition when he wakes. He's dehydrated, weak, disoriented, but he's not as far gone as he should be. His IV site, visible in the scene, doesn't show signs of severe infection. He doesn't have catastrophic bed sores, which would be expected after 59 days of immobility without someone turning him regularly. He's able to walk, albeit shakily, which suggests his muscles haven't completely atrophied. All of this points to care, to someone doing the minimum necessary to keep him alive. Not full medical attention, he's clearly suffering, but enough to prevent the worst outcomes. And that care, sporadic and insufficient as it might have been, is what bought Rick the time to wake up. If Dr. Gale or someone like her tended Rick even irregularly checking on him once every few days, replacing an IV bag here and there, repositioning him to prevent sores, it'd explain why he's alive, but barely. He's not thriving. He's surviving on the edge, kept just functional enough to wake when his body decides it's time to fight or die. The pattern here, the thing that makes this theory feel right, even without confirmation, is that The Walking Dead loves to show us consequences we don't fully understand until later. The show's built on mysteries that resolve episodes or seasons down the line, on callbacks that make you rethink earlier scenes. And Rick's survival, presented in episode 1 as almost magical, as the improbable beginning of his hero's journey, gets more complicated the more you think about it. It's not magic. It's someone's choice, someone's sacrifice, someone's broken attempt at doing good in a world that stopped rewarding goodness. And whether that someone was Dr. Gale specifically, or just another forgotten survivor with a streak of mercy they couldn't quite kill, the point's the same. Rick lived because someone chose him, and that person died without ever knowing if it mattered. Let's talk about the medical reality for a moment, because understanding what Rick's body went through makes his survival even more improbable and the theory of intervention even more necessary. A person in a coma is completely dependent on external care. They can't eat, can't drink, can't move. Without intervention, they'll die within days, maybe a week at most, from dehydration. The human body's mostly water, and we lose it constantly, through breathing, through skin, through basic metabolic processes. In a hospital setting, coma patients receive IV fluids continuously to replace what's lost. Those IV bags need to be replaced every 24 to 48 hours, depending on the flow rate and the patient's needs. Miss a replacement, and dehydration begins. Miss several, and the patient's organs start to fail. It's not a slow process. It's urgent, medical, life or death, every single day. Rick's 4, the one we see in Shane's flashback, and again when Rick wakes, represents a lifeline. As long as that IV's functioning, as long as there's fluid in the bag and the line's not infected or blocked, Rick has a chance. But the moment that bag empties, the clock starts ticking. He has maybe 48 to 72 hours before dehydration becomes critical. After that, his kidneys fail, his brain swells, and he dies. There's no coming back from severe dehydration without immediate medical intervention, and there's no medical intervention in an abandoned hospital. So the question becomes, how long could Rick's 4 have lasted after the power died and the staff evacuated? And the answer is, not long enough. If Shane's visit was around day 15, and the hospital was already in chaos. The IV bag Shane saw might have been the last one. It might have run out by day 17 or 18, which means Rick needed someone to replace it, and soon, or he'd have been dead long before day 59. Here's the theory, framed as clearly as I can. If Rick survived until day 59, someone replaced his IV. Maybe once, maybe multiple times. Maybe they had medical knowledge, or maybe they just figured it out through trial and error, hooking up saline bags from the hospital's supply closets and hoping it was enough. That person, whether it was Dr. Gale or another survivor, would have needed access to Rick's room, which means moving the gurney Shane placed. They'd have needed to find IV supplies, which in a ransacked hospital wouldn't have been easy, but also wouldn't have been impossible. Saline bags, IV lines, needles, these are common medical supplies, and a hospital the size of Rick's would have had stockpiles, and they'd have needed a reason to bother. Because saving Rick wasn't practical. He's dead weight, literally. He can't fight, can't contribute, can't help them survive. Saving Rick's a choice made from compassion or desperation, or maybe just loneliness. A choice to keep one person alive because keeping them alive is the only thing that makes you feel human anymore. The alternative explanation is that Rick survived on luck and biology, that his body, in a coma state, required less hydration than normal, that the last IV bag lasted longer than expected, or that he somehow retained enough fluid to make it to day 59. And maybe there's some truth to that. The show doesn't give us enough information to rule it out, but it strains credibility. It asks us to believe Rick defied medical reality, that he survived because the plot needed him to, and while The Walking Dead's not a documentary, it's usually better than that. It usually grounds its improbabilities in human choices, in people doing things that are unlikely but not impossible. And someone tending Rick, even sporadically, even inadequately, is unlikely but not impossible. It's the kind of thing that happens in the margins of disaster, when one person can't save the world but can save one life, and they do it because the alternative is giving up completely. The timeline works if we assume care until around day 50. Let's say Dr. Gale or another survivor tended Rick from day 20 to day 50, replacing his IV every week or so, just enough to keep him alive. That's 30 days of intervention, which buys Rick time. Then, around day 50, the caretaker dies or leaves, and Rick's on his own. The last IV bag runs dry by day 52 or 53, and Rick starts to dehydrate. His body, stressed and shutting down, forces him awake on day 59 as a last survival response. He's not healed, he's dying. But consciousness gives him a chance to find water, to move, to survive. And he does, barely, stumbling through the hospital in search of hydration. That's not a miracle. That's biology and desperation and a thin thread of luck that held just long enough. And behind it all, invisible and unacknowledged, is the person who gave him those extra 30 days. The person who chose him. The person who died before seeing him wake. While Rick slept, the CDC was collapsing. Dr. Edwin Jenner, the man Rick's group meets in Season 1, Episode 5, was alone in that facility, recording everything. His logs, shown on screen when Rick's group arrives, are some of the most detailed records we have of the outbreak's timeline. Jenner mentions that he's been alone for weeks, that other facilities went dark one by one, that the French were the last to claim they were close to a solution before they, too, went silent. And on the screen when Rick's group enters, there's a timestamp, day 63, which means Rick's been with the group for a few days by then, traveling from the quarry to the CDC. Working backward, Rick woke around day 59, maybe day 58. That timeline, confirmed by Jenner's meticulous record-keeping, is the anchor we use to understand how long Rick was unconscious, and how long the world had to fall apart without him. Jenner's isolation is haunting because it's voluntary. He stays at the CDC not because he's trapped, but because he believes he can solve the outbreak. He's a scientist, and science is built on hope. The hope that observation, experimentation, and reason can find answers, even when everything's falling apart. But as the days pass, as his wife dies and turns, as every other facility stops responding, Jenner's hope curdles into despair. He keeps working, keeps recording, but there's a futility to it. He knows he's alone. He knows no one's coming. And yet he stays, documenting the end, because documentation's all he has left. It's a form of control, a way of saying, I was here, I tried, I saw what happened. And when Rick's group arrives, Jenner's been in the dark, the facility's power failing, the automated systems shutting down for over a month. He's survived that long on reserves, on the CDC's backup generators. But those are running out too. He's on borrowed time, same as Rick was. The parallel between Jenner and Rick's theoretical caretaker is striking. Both are people who stayed behind, alone, trying to keep something alive. Jenner trying to keep the research alive, the caretaker trying to keep Rick alive. Both are operating in the ruins of institutions that were supposed to save people but couldn't. And both, ultimately, fail in the sense that the world doesn't reward their efforts. Jenner's research goes nowhere. The CDC explodes. Rick's caretaker, if they existed, dies before Rick wakes. But both of them tried. And that trying, that refusal to give up, even when giving up is the rational choice, is what makes them human. It's also what makes them tragic. Because The Walking Dead's a show where trying isn't enough, where good intentions don't protect you, where the people who hold on to hope the longest are often the ones who suffer the most. Jenner survives long enough to meet Rick's group, but he's so broken by isolation and failure that he tries to kill them all in the CDC explosion, believing death is mercy. Rick's caretaker, if they existed, survives long enough to keep Rick alive, but they don't live to see him wake, don't know if their care mattered. Jenner's recordings give us the only reliable timeline for the outbreak, and they tell us something important. The collapse was fast. He mentions that communication broke down within days, that the government, the military, the entire infrastructure failed almost immediately. There was no slow decline, no months of gradual deterioration. The world ended quickly, and the survivors are the ones who adapted just as quickly. Rick missed that adaptation period. He was unconscious during the time when people were learning the rules, figuring out that headshots work, that noise attracts walkers, that groups offer safety, but also danger. By the time Rick wakes, those lessons have already been learned, paid for in blood by people like Shane and Morgan and the quarry camp survivors. Rick gets to skip the education and learn from their experience, which is an advantage. But it's also a burden, because he didn't earn that knowledge through suffering. He received it secondhand. And that gap, that missing experience, shapes his entire arc. He leads with pre-apocalypse morality because he wasn't broken by the first weeks. He still believes in laws, in mercy, in second chances, because he didn't have to abandon those beliefs to survive. And whether that makes him a better leader or a more naive one is the question the show spends years exploring. While Rick was unconscious, the world outside was learning a new rule: the dead outnumber the living. And they're getting better at finding you. Not smarter. Exactly. Walkers in The Walking Dead don't think or plan, but more present. In those first weeks, when the outbreak began, walkers were scattered. Individuals stumbling around, easy to avoid if you stayed quiet and moved carefully. But as the days passed, as more people died and turned, the walkers started to accumulate. Cities like Atlanta, where populations were dense and evacuation efforts failed, became death traps filled with thousands of walkers. And those walkers, driven by rudimentary instincts to follow noise and movement, started to form herds. Not organized herds like we'd see later with the Whisperers, but natural congregations, walkers following each other towards stimuli, creating masses of undead that were far more dangerous than individuals. Morgan Jones, the man who saves Rick in episode 1, talks about this. He's been observing the walkers, learning their patterns, and he tells Rick that they're more active at night, that they follow sound, that they're drawn to places where the living used to gather. Morgan's observations are the result of weeks of survival, of watching his wife turn, of keeping his son Dwayne safe in a world that's trying to kill them both. And when Rick wakes and stumbles into Morgan's house, Morgan teaches him the rules: headshots, noise discipline, stay quiet, stay hidden, don't draw attention. These rules are second nature to Morgan by day 59, but they're brand new to Rick, and that difference, that gulf of experience, is what makes Rick vulnerable. He doesn't know the world he's woken into, doesn't understand the patterns, and he survives his first day mostly through luck and Morgan's intervention. The theory here is that the world Rick woke to was significantly more dangerous than the world that existed when he first fell into a coma. During week 1, when the outbreak was fresh, a survivor could potentially talk their way through a situation, could reason with other people, could rely on the remnants of law and order. By week 8, when Rick woke, none of that existed anymore. The people left alive were the ones who'd learned to prioritize survival over everything else. The walkers had accumulated in cities, making urban areas nearly impossible to navigate, and the window for rescue, for government intervention, for some authority to restore order, that window had closed. Rick woke into a world that had already accepted the apocalypse, that had moved past denial and bargaining and into the grim business of staying alive one more day. And he had to catch up fast, or he'd die. Morgan gave him the crash course, but Rick's real education would come later, with the group, as he faced threats Morgan couldn't have prepared him for. There's a somber realization here, one that sits heavy when you think about it too long. Every day Rick was asleep, someone else was dying and learning the lessons he'd need. The rules Morgan taught Rick were paid for by people who didn't survive long enough to pass them on. The understanding that walkers are drawn to noise, learned by someone who made noise and died. The knowledge that you have to destroy the brain, learned by people who tried other methods and failed. Rick's education was built on the corpses of strangers, and he'd never meet them, never thank them, never know their names. He just benefited from their deaths, absorbed their lessons, and moved forward. That's survival in The Walking Dead. It's not about being special or chosen. It's about being lucky enough to learn from other people's mistakes before those mistakes kill you too. And Rick, sleeping through the worst of it, protected by circumstance or by doctor. Gale's hypothetical care was lucky. He woke with a clean slate, with pre-apocalypse morality intact, and he got to learn the rules from people who'd already paid the price. That advantage, invisible and unearned, is part of why he becomes a leader. He's not weighed down by the early trauma, not broken by the choices others had to make. He's fresh. And in a world of broken people, freshness looks like strength. While Rick slept, people tried to rebuild. It's easy to forget, watching the show, that the survivors we follow aren't the only ones who had the idea of forming groups, establishing safe zones, trying to hold on to some fragment of civilization. In those first weeks, countless groups attempted exactly that. They barricaded buildings, pooled resources, set up perimeters, and almost all of them failed. We see the evidence throughout Season 1 and 2 abandoned camps, fortified structures that were overrun, bodies left behind in defensive positions. Every boarded-up window, every makeshift barricade, every empty shelter represents a group that thought they could make it, that believed in their plan, and that was proven wrong. The apocalypse is littered with failed optimism, and Rick walks through the graveyard of those attempts without even realizing it. The theory is that these early attempts failed for a few reasons. First, people didn't understand the threat yet. They thought walkers were like any other disaster, something you could wait out, something that would pass once help arrived. So they hunkered down, rationed supplies, and waited for rescue that never came. When supplies ran out, they tried to venture out for more, and that's when they got overrun. Second, groups in the early days were too trusting. They let strangers in, believed in cooperation, operated under the assumption that everyone was on the same side, and sometimes that worked. But other times, it let in people who were dangerous, who prioritized their own survival over the group's, who caused conflicts that tore communities apart from the inside. The quarry camp Rick joins is one of the few early groups that survives, and it survives partly because Shane's paranoid enough to vet newcomers, ruthless enough to establish rules, and lucky enough that the group stays small and mobile. Timeline-wise, these failed communities would have collapsed mostly during weeks 2 through 6. Week 2 is when the initial panic's over and people start trying to organize. Week 3 is when supplies start running low and groups have to make hard decisions about rationing and scavenging. Weeks 4 through 6 are when the cracks appear: interpersonal conflicts, resource shortages, walker attacks that breach defenses. By week 8, when Rick wakes, the landscape's already been picked clean of easy survival spots. The low-hanging fruit, the grocery stores, the pharmacies, the gas stations have all been looted. The defensible positions that could be held by small groups have either been claimed by survivors or overrun by walkers. Rick's waking into a world where the easy options are gone, where survival requires more effort, more risk, more compromise than it did in those first weeks. Morgan's house, the one Rick stumbles into, is a perfect example of a sustainable early survival strategy. It's a residential home, not a fortress. It's stocked with supplies Morgan scavenged, not hoarded from the start. And it's defended by one man and his son, not a large group with complex dynamics. Morgan survived by staying small, staying quiet, staying off everyone's radar. He's learned that big groups draw attention, that fortified positions become targets, that the best defense is to be invisible. Rick will learn these lessons too, but not yet. When he wakes, he's still thinking like a sheriff, like someone who believes in rescue and order and the idea that groups working together can overcome anything. It'll take the farm, the prison, Terminus, and a dozen other failures before Rick fully internalizes what Morgan already knows. Survival in The Walking Dead isn't about building. It's about adapting, moving, never staying in one place long enough for the world to crush you. The emotional weight here is in the realization that Rick's entire journey, all the communities he tries to build, all the times he believes this time it'll work, this time we'll be safe, it's all been tried before. During those weeks he was asleep, people just like him tried to build Alexandrias and hilltops and kingdoms, and they failed. Their bones are in the ruins. Rick walks past without noticing. Their hope died so Rick could have his turn at hoping. And maybe that's the point. Maybe The Walking Dead isn't about succeeding at building civilization. Maybe it's about trying anyway, even when history says you'll fail, even when the evidence suggests hope is naive. Maybe Rick's strength isn't that he's special. It's that he's stubborn enough to keep trying after everyone else has given up. And he can be that stubborn because he didn't see the early failures, didn't watch the first attempts collapse. He slept through the lesson that hope is pointless. And sometimes, ignorance is the only thing that lets you keep hoping. While Rick slept, the people he'd eventually lead were changing. Shane's transformation is the most dramatic, but it's not the only one. Lori, grieving her husband, accepts comfort from Shane and enters into a relationship that'll haunt all three of them. Carl, just a boy, watches his mother make that choice and starts learning that the old rules don't apply anymore, that his father's gone and his family's different now. At the quarry camp, Carol's being abused by Ed, and no one's intervening because survival takes priority over domestic violence. Dale's watching over everyone, trying to maintain some semblance of moral order. But he's outnumbered by people who think mercy's a luxury they can't afford. And Andrea, mourning her sister Amy's death, is learning that grief in the apocalypse doesn't get time to breathe. You bury the dead and move on, because stopping means dying. Shane's change is the most relevant to Rick's story, so let's focus there. In Season 1, when Rick's group arrives at the quarry and Shane sees Rick alive, Shane's face shows a dozen emotions at once: joy, relief, guilt, fear. He's thrilled his best friend's alive. He's terrified of what it means for his relationship with Lori. And he's guilt-ridden because he told Lori that Rick was dead. And he believed it. And he used that belief to justify getting close to her. Shane's not a villain in those early episodes. He's a man who made choices based on the information he had, who tried to protect Lori and Carl in Rick's absence, and who's now confronted with the fact that his choices have consequences. Rick being alive doesn't erase what Shane did. It just complicates it, makes everything messy and painful in ways that can't be fixed. The theory here is that Shane's transformation during Rick's coma from loyal partner and friend to someone willing to lie, manipulate, and eventually kill to protect what he thinks is his. That transformation is what the apocalypse does to people who don't have Rick's advantage. Shane didn't get to sleep through the collapse. He was awake for all of it. He watched people die. He made impossible choices. He lied to Lori to spare her the pain of hoping Rick might be alive. And those choices, necessary and pragmatic as they seemed at the time, eroded Shane's sense of self. By the time Rick wakes, Shane's not the same person. He's harder, more ruthless, more willing to prioritize survival over morality. And he resents Rick for still being the man Shane used to be, for having the luxury of pre-apocalypse ethics, for being able to lead with mercy because he didn't have to make the choices Shane made. Lori's position is similarly complicated. She believed Rick was dead. Shane told her he was, and she had no reason to doubt him. And in a world where tomorrow isn't guaranteed, where staying alive requires alliances and support, she accepted comfort from Shane. It's not a betrayal in the traditional sense, because she thought Rick was gone. But when Rick returns, when she realizes Shane lied or was wrong, the guilt consumes her. She feels like she betrayed Rick, even though rationally she knows she didn't. And that guilt, combined with Shane's possessiveness and Rick's confusion, creates a toxic dynamic that poisons all their interactions. Lori can't be honest with Rick about her relationship with Shane without hurting him. She can't be honest with Shane about choosing Rick without enraging him. So she tries to navigate between them, and it doesn't work. And eventually it contributes to Shane's breakdown and his attempt to kill Rick in season 2. The emotional weight of this, the thing that makes it tragic, is that all three of them are trying to do the right thing. Rick's trying to reclaim his family, to be the husband and father he was before the coma. Lori's trying to support Rick while managing Shane's feelings and her own guilt. Shane's trying to protect the woman and child he's come to see as his family, while dealing with the resentment and jealousy of seeing Rick take them back. There's no villain here, just three people making bad decisions under impossible circumstances, all of them shaped by the time Rick was asleep. If Rick had never woken up, Shane and Lori might have built something functional. If Rick had woken a week earlier, before Shane and Lori's relationship solidified, maybe things would have been different. But the timing, that specific moment when Rick woke on day 59, ensured maximum pain for everyone involved. And that's the cost of Rick's survival. Not just medical improbability or doctor, Gale's hypothetical sacrifice, but the emotional wreckage created by his absence and his return. Rick slept through the collapse, but he woke up to the consequences. And those consequences, built during the weeks he was unconscious, would shape everything that came after. Day 59 arrives, and Rick Grimes opens his eyes. That's the moment everything changes. The moment the show begins. The moment Rick's story shifts from passive survival to active participation. But before that moment, before consciousness, Rick's body is failing. The medical reality we talked about earlier, the dehydration, the muscle atrophy, the organ stress, all of that is reaching a critical point. If the theory's correct, if someone like Dr. Gale was tending Rick until around day 50, then he's been without consistent care for about 9 days. The last IV bags run dry. His body's been operating on reserves, shutting down non-essential functions, prioritizing the brain and heart while everything else deteriorates. He's not waking up because he's healed. He's waking up because he's dying, and his body's making a final, desperate attempt to find water, to move, to survive. The moment of consciousness is involuntary. Rick doesn't choose to wake up. His body forces him awake, floods him with adrenaline, and he opens his eyes to a world he doesn't understand. The flowers on the nightstand are dead, wilted brown. The machines around him are silent. No beeping, no lights. The room's dim, lit only by sunlight filtering through a window. And there's a smell, death, decay, something wrong. Rick tries to process it, but his mind's sluggish, confused. He remembers being shot, remembers the hospital, but he doesn't know how much time has passed. Days? Weeks? The clock on the wall stopped at 3:47, which tells him nothing except that the power's been out long enough for the clock to die. He tries to sit up, and his muscles scream. Atrophy's made movement painful, and when he swings his legs over the side of the bed, he nearly collapses. But he doesn't. He stands, shakily, and he takes his first steps into the apocalypse. The gurney's still near the door, moved aside enough for Rick to push through, but positioned like it was serving a purpose. Rick doesn't think about it. He's too disoriented, too focused on the immediate need for water. His throat's dry, his lips cracked, and every instinct is screaming for hydration. He stumbles into the hallway, and that's when he sees the first body, a walker, motionless in the corridor, dried blood on the walls, the smell overwhelming. Rick doesn't understand yet. He thinks it's a corpse, someone who died during whatever disaster struck. He moves past it carefully, quietly, and he makes his way through the hospital looking for answers. The cafeteria doors with "Don't open dead inside" spray painted across them, the blood smears, the overturned gurneys, the emergency exit chained shut. Every detail tells a story, but Rick doesn't have the context to read it yet. He's still thinking like a sheriff, like someone investigating a crime scene, not someone trying to survive one. When Rick finally makes it outside, when he sees the military barricade and the abandoned vehicles and the corpses everywhere, that's when the scale hits him. This isn't a disaster. It's the end. The world he knew is gone, replaced by something he can't name yet. He stumbles down the road, weak and dehydrated, and he's saved by luck when he finds Morgan's house. Morgan, who's been observing Rick through binoculars, who saw him wandering and decided to help. Dwayne, Morgan's son, nearly kills Rick, thinking he's a walker. But Morgan stops him, and they bring Rick inside, give him water, let him rest. And when Rick wakes again, really wakes, with his mind clear enough to ask questions, Morgan explains, the dead are walking. The government's gone. Everyone Rick knew is probably dead. And Rick, processing this, trying to understand, finally asks the question that defines his entire arc: where's my family? The emotional weight of Rick's awakening isn't in the spectacle of the empty hospital, or the horror of the walkers. It's in the quiet realization that he's lost time, lost people, lost everything. He doesn't know if Lori and Carl are alive. He doesn't know where they are, or how to find them. And he's just learned that the world doesn't operate on the rules he spent his life enforcing. Law and order are gone. Survival's the only law now. And Rick, still clinging to his sheriff's morality, has to figure out how to navigate a world that's already moved past the values he represents. His first instinct is to find his family. His second is to help others, to protect Morgan and Dwayne, to be the kind of man he was before the coma. And Morgan, watching Rick, sees both strength and naivety. Rick's going to learn fast, or he's going to die. And Morgan, having already buried his wife and lost most of his hope, isn't sure which outcome is more likely. What Rick sees when he wakes tells a story, but it's a story he doesn't have the tools to understand yet. The wilted flowers on his nightstand, for example. They're brown, dead, but not completely desiccated. That suggests they've been without water for weeks, but not months. If Rick had been unconscious for half a year, the flowers would be dust. The fact that they're still recognizably flowers gives us a timeline clue, one that fits with the 59-day theory. Then there's the IV bag, hanging above Rick's bed. It's empty, the tubing dry, which means it's been days since any fluid ran through it. But the IV site on Rick's arm, while bruised, doesn't show signs of severe infection. That's significant because an IV left in place for weeks without maintenance would almost certainly get infected. The fact that Rick's foresight is relatively clean suggests someone removed and replaced the line fairly recently, maybe within the last 2 weeks. It's not definitive proof of care, but it's consistent with the theory that someone was tending him until shortly before he woke. The gurney at the door is the most overt clue. Shane placed it there as a barricade. We know that from the flashback. But when Rick wakes, it's been moved enough that he can open the door and leave. Yet it's not scattered or destroyed. It's repositioned nearby, like someone moved it deliberately and then put it back. That's not the work of looters or walkers. That's intent. Someone was using Rick's room, accessing him, and maintaining the barricade as best they could. And Rick, seeing the gurney, doesn't think twice about it. He assumes it was placed to keep walkers out, which is partially true, but he doesn't realize it was also there to mark his room, to signal to anyone who wandered by that this room was occupied, protected, off limits. If Dr. Gale or another survivor was checking on Rick, that gurney was their system. Move it, tend to Rick, replace it. A simple routine that kept Rick alive and hidden from others who might have killed him for his supplies, or mercy killed him to save a dose of morphine for someone more likely to survive. And then there's the cafeteria. Rick walks past those doors, sees "Don't open dead" inside, and takes it as a warning. Which it is. But he doesn't open them, doesn't see what's inside, doesn't learn that someone was keeping walkers in there as a twisted memorial. If he had opened those doors, if he'd seen Dr. Gale's patients locked inside, he might have understood that the hospital's last days were darker and more complicated than he imagined. He might have realized someone stayed, someone made choices, someone tried to save who they could even as everything fell apart. But Rick doesn't open the doors. He moves on. And the story of what happened in that hospital stays locked away, hidden behind chain and spray paint. It's a metaphor for Rick's entire arc. He's walking through the aftermath of tragedy, surrounded by clues and evidence, but he doesn't have time to process it all. He's too busy surviving to mourn, too focused on the future to understand the past. The emotional anchor here is in what Rick doesn't see. He doesn't see the effort Shane made to barricade him. He doesn't see the weeks of care that might have kept him alive. He doesn't see the bodies of staff who died trying to evacuate patients, or the supplies hoarded in closets by survivors who didn't make it. He just sees the result: an empty hospital, a dead world, and himself alive against all odds. And because he doesn't see the work behind his survival, he can't thank anyone for it. He can only move forward, carrying the weight of being alive without fully understanding why. That ignorance is both a blessing and a curse. It lets Rick stay optimistic, lets him believe in his own strength and destiny, because he doesn't know how much luck and other people's sacrifice contributed to his survival. But it also means he's carrying a debt he'll never be able to repay, to people whose names he'll never know, whose choices saved him and then vanished into the silence of an empty hospital. Rick's awakening isn't just his story beginning. It's the moment his timeline reconnects with the world's timeline, and the dissonance between the two is striking. For Rick, subjectively, it's been one night. He was shot, he went into surgery, and now he's waking up. Everything in between is darkness, absence, a void where time didn't exist. But for the world, it's been 59 days, 2 months of chaos, collapse, death, and adaptation. The government fell. The military failed. Millions died. Survivors learned new rules, formed new groups, became new versions of themselves. And Rick missed all of it. To him, the apocalypse happened overnight. To everyone else, it's been a slow grind of survival, and they're exhausted, traumatized, changed by the experience in ways Rick can't yet understand. This gap, this difference in subjective experience, shapes everything Rick does in Season 1 and beyond. He makes decisions based on pre-apocalypse morality, the belief that law matters, that people can be reasoned with, that society can be rebuilt, and sometimes he's right. His optimism, his refusal to give up on humanity, inspires people. It's why the group follows him, why they trust him even when his decisions are questionable. But other times, his morality clashes with the realities of survival. Shane sees it immediately, sees that Rick's mercy is going to get people killed, and Shane's frustration grows into resentment, and eventually into the confrontation that ends with Shane's death in Season 2. The tension between Rick's idealism and Shane's pragmatism is really a tension between two timelines: Rick's, which still has room for hope, and Shane's, which has been ground down by 59 days of impossible choices. The theory I keep coming back to is this: Rick's leadership works because he missed the trauma. He didn't have to watch neighbors turn into monsters. He didn't have to abandon children who were bitten. He didn't have to make the choice between shooting someone who was infected or letting them turn and kill others. All the moral compromises that broke people like Shane, that turned Carol from a victim into a survivor willing to kill children to protect the group, that made Daryl shut down emotionally. Rick didn't have to make those compromises. He gets to learn the rules without the accompanying trauma, which means he can hold on to mercy, hope, and empathy in ways others can't. That's his strength. But it's also why people like Shane find him frustrating. Because Rick's idealism feels like privilege to someone who's had to live through the collapse, who's had to make the hard calls, who's had to become something they hate in order to survive. And yet, Rick's not naive. He's not a fool. He learns fast, adapts, makes brutal choices when he has to. But there's always a hesitation, a moment where he tries to find another way, and that hesitation is the residue of his missing 59 days. It's the part of him that still believes the world can be more than just survival, that people can be more than just killers or victims. And whether that belief is right or wrong, whether it saves the group or endangers them, is the question. The Walking Dead spends 11 seasons exploring. Rick's story is about whether pre-apocalypse morality can survive the apocalypse, whether hope is strength or weakness, whether the man who slept through the end of the world can lead the people who lived through it. And the answer, frustratingly, is sometimes. Sometimes Rick's hope inspires people to be better. Sometimes it gets people killed. And Rick has to live with both outcomes, has to carry the weight of his choices, while also carrying the invisible weight of the care that kept him alive during those 59 days. He's a survivor, but he's also a beneficiary. And that distinction matters, even if Rick never fully grasps it. The final image of Rick's awakening, the one that stays with me, is him standing outside the hospital, looking at the military barricade, the abandoned Humvees, the bodies in the parking lot. He's still in his hospital gown, barefoot, weak from dehydration, and he sees a child's shoe on the ground, just one shoe, and he picks it up. He doesn't say anything. He just holds it for a moment, and you can see on his face the realization that children died here, that families died here, that this wasn't a clean disaster. It was chaos and terror, and people dying alone or watching their loved ones die. And Rick puts the shoe down and keeps moving, because there's nothing else he can do. He's alive. The world's dead. And somewhere out there, maybe, his family's alive too. And that hope, fragile and irrational as it is what pulls him forward. The clock started again. Rick's time and the world's time are synchronized now. And whatever comes next, Rick will face it awake, aware, and searching for the people who make survival worth the effort. We're back in the hospital room now, standing where Rick woke. The wilted flowers are still on the nightstand, the IV bag still empty, the clock on the wall still stopped at 3:47. But the meaning's different now, isn't it? After tracing the timeline, after exploring the theories, after understanding the gaps in Rick's story, this room feels less like the beginning of a hero's journey and more like a monument to questions we'll never answer. Did someone tend Rick during those 59 days? We think so. The medical reality, the moved gurney, the relatively clean IV site, all of it suggests care, intervention, someone choosing to keep Rick alive. Was it Dr. Gale, the woman from the webisode who marked cafeteria doors with warnings and kept walkers as a twisted memorial? Maybe. The timelines fit, the locations are close, and her broken moral framework would have seen Rick as worth saving. But we don't know. The show never tells us. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Rick's survival is meant to be a mystery. A reminder that in the apocalypse, people are saved by strangers they'll never meet, by choices they'll never know about, by luck and timing and the invisible labor of those who stay behind. Rick woke up because someone placed a gurney to protect him, because someone might have replaced his IV, because someone or something bought him enough time to make it to day 59. And that person, whoever they were, died without recognition, without thanks, without knowing if it mattered. Their stories written in the gaps, in the evidence that doesn't quite add up, in the absence of an explanation for how Rick survived the unsurvivable. They're not Shane, whose protection we see in the flashback. They're not Morgan, who saves Rick after he wakes. They're the person in between, the one who filled the gap, the invisible guardian who kept death at bay just long enough. And here's the emotional truth underneath all the theory and speculation. Rick's survival required 3 things. Shane's protection, which gave Rick a few extra days when the hospital first fell. Possible care from Dr. Gale or another survivor, which extended Rick's life through the middle weeks when dehydration should have killed him. And finally, that caretaker's death or departure, which freed Rick from the risk that he'd be mercy killed as a waste of resources. Rick needed someone to save him, and then he needed them to stop saving him, because staying under someone's control in the apocalypse is its own kind of death. He needed to wake alone, with agency, with the ability to choose his own path. And that's what he got, at the cost of never knowing who to thank. The gurney sits there still, a barrier that was placed and moved and replaced, a symbol of protection that's also a symbol of abandonment. Shane placed it and left. Someone else moved it and tended Rick. And then Rick woke, alone, and pushed it aside to step into the apocalypse. 3 stages, 3 choices, 3 people shaping Rick's survival without his knowledge or consent. And Rick, walking away from that hospital with Morgan, never looks back. He's too focused on finding his family, on moving forward, on surviving the next day and the day after that. He doesn't have time to mourn the hospital, to wonder who stayed behind, to piece together the evidence of his own rescue. He just lives, and that living is the only answer to the question of whether his survival mattered. It did. Because Rick uses the life he was given to protect others, to build communities, to fight for the idea that humanity's worth preserving. He doesn't waste the gift, even though he doesn't know it was a gift. The clock on the wall, stopped at 3:47, represents the moment the hospital lost power, the moment time stopped mattering in the old sense and started being measured in days survived instead of hours worked. And when Rick opens his eyes, the clock doesn't restart. It stays frozen, a monument to the world that ended while Rick slept. But Rick's internal clock, his sense of time and purpose, that restarts. He begins counting his days not from the outbreak, but from his awakening. Day 1 is when he wakes, when he finds Morgan, when he learns the rules. Everything before is prehistory, time that happened to him but not with him. And maybe that's the final answer to the mystery of Rick's survival. He lived because time needed him to. The world needed someone who still believed in the old rules, who still thought mercy and hope and leadership mattered, who hadn't been ground down by the first 59 days of hell. Shane couldn't be that person. He'd been changed too much. But Rick could, because Rick slept through the change. He woke fresh, ignorant, still believing the world could be saved. And sometimes, ignorance is the only thing that makes hope possible. The clock stopped at 3:47. But Rick's story started at day 59. And in the gap between those 2 times, in the silence of an empty hospital, someone chose to save him. And that choice, invisible and unnamed, made everything else possible.